that, I think, along with the myths, and I think if Phillip is actually right because it's very interesting, he did a portfolio called the Myths Portfolio. And in it, he includes the image of Uncle Sam, which is in the photo that was made into that print, is in the show. Then there were other myths that were actually sort of more traditional children's myths. The Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz, and I'm sure everyone has seen that film or seen the Broadway show. Aunt Jemima, an image of a kindly slave from the middle of the 19th century, which that was not a true image, but it's definitely part of American history. And then Warhol included a portrait of himself as the Shadow. And the Shadow was a very famous radio program during the 1930s and 40s that Warhol and his family would have listened to, and it was always about this shadow, this figure that was watching out for the good of people and would punish evil things, but no one ever knew who the shadow was. And in this image, Warhol shows his face and then his shadow being projected on ad infinitum, suggesting that he somehow got that his fame would continue. But what was even more interesting is for someone who's aware of the history of art, many people believe that the mythology of art was that the first time someone made a drawing was years ago, many thousands of years ago in the era before Christ, when a young man was about to go off to war, some unknown warrior, and he fell asleep after eating, and he was sleeping in this cave, and the light from the fire cast his shadow on the wall. And his girlfriend, to remember him, took a piece of wood, stuck it in the fire, and with the embers, with the ashes, followed his shadow and drew his profile so that she would always remember him, especially if he would die. So in a sense, Warhol was quoting popular culture, but also the history of art. And something that I guess I'd like to say at this point is, we've been talking about Warhol from a sociological and political and maybe ideological point of view, but something that was always very present in his work and in his mind was where he sat in the history of art. I remember I knew Warhol for about 20 years, not as a good friend, but in the art world. And you could only know him so well unless you were one of 5 people who were in his inner circle. And at that point, people were beginning to say, oh, at some point there'll be some Warhol museum. They never thought it would be in Pittsburgh. And I said to Andy, where would you like your museum to be? Part of the Whitney Museum that had done a show of his work, part at the Museum of Modern Art that had never chosen to show his work up until that time. And he said, oh, no, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I think the notion there was not that it was the biggest, but that he wanted to be seen not just next to Jasper Johns or de Kooning, artists of his generation, as Phillip has mentioned, but next to Michelangelo, and next to Leonardo, and next to Velázquez, and next to Rubens. He saw himself as making quotations from their art just as well as from Campbell's soup cans. And interestingly, in the latter part of his years, and I don't think there are any examples in this show, he started making abstract work, which he had never done before. And the first abstract work he made was, oh yes, there's one, the portrait, Camouflage. And he said, I'm going to make war pictures. And everyone took that to mean, well, he was taking camouflage, and he actually went to an army store and got some of the fabric that the military wear when they're fighting in the jungle. And oh, that's what it meant, war pictures. But I think he meant something very different. The war for him was the war between figuration and abstraction, something that has gone on in the history of art for all times, from antiquity to the present. And he was saying, hey, I've been making this one kind of art in the public for 25 years. Now I'm going to trick you, and I'm going to show you I can do just what Jackson Pollock, etc., was doing many years ago when I was a student, when I first came to New York. I could do that too. That's not so hard. And so he was constantly tricking you. And the one interesting thing is, you'll see this wonderful Warhol show that Phillip has put together, but you then can go and come to my museum, or there's a show now in Paris, there's going to be a show in Seoul, Korea very soon, because Warhol changed so much that every year he'd come up with a different way. His mind he had such a big brain that he was confronting not only the world, but art, and all the people who ever made art.
I think that touches on a very interesting aspect of Warhol's work. Warhol was interested in addressing the really big questions. For all that it appears to be tied into the technology of the time or can seem faddish or fashionable, Warhol was really addressing the classical theme. You have love, you have sex, death, beauty, and these are, you know, the same things that, you know, as Tom said, Leonardo and Michelangelo were obsessed with. So it has a much more than local interest. But I think of Warhol really as an artist in drag, and by that I don't mean that obviously Warhol himself was not a drag queen. He didn't, you know, derive a sexual satisfaction from dressing up like a woman, but in a lot of his work he was constantly riffing on art that already existed in the world. So in the same way that he was taking things that the mind already knew, like the cross or the Statue of Liberty or Marilyn Monroe, and making that the basis of his paintings, he was also referring formally to things that were contemporaneous or that had preceded him. So that, for example, the Brillo boxes are a reference to Donald Judd, or could be seen also as, you know, a kind of slapstick of Carl Andre, the repetition of a single unit or the expansion of a given term. You have, you know, in the Rorschach paintings, which unfortunately we don't have in the show, are kind of reprise of Jackson Pollock and the drip paintings, or probably better, the oxidation paintings, which were made by various people who would come to the studio and piss on a primed canvas, and the resulting oxidized splashes and splotches were the painting that was eventually sold in the gallery. And this is, you know, kind of a tongue-in-cheek, you know, reference to Jackson Pollock. So much of the work can be seen in that way, and I see that in a sense as being the, you know, one of his core procedures. It's not to say that he's not original. I mean, the total project is extremely original because no one had ever made art in quite that way. And as I said, he used extremely pragmatic means to address the large questions. But I think that accounts for for the reason that he was such a polarizing figure for most of his life. That, and of course, the fact that he was a flamboyant homosexual in a time when this was just not acceptable. So, you know, in short, I think Warhol's work is really united by a specific pathology, a level of identification with the American dream, and with, you know, with stardom and fame that you simply don't see in his contemporaries. I mean, Roy Lichtenstein, or, you know, whatever you think of his work, or James Rosenquist, or, you know, to take another example, someone like Donald Judd, I mean, they simply weren't very exciting people outside of their work, whereas Warhol really wanted to live the nightlife. He wanted to go to a great club. He wanted to become a known figure. He crafted an extremely legible and visible image for himself so that people would see the wig, they'd see the leather jacket and say, oh, that's Andy Warhol. There's a rumor that in the 70s he hired a couple of stunt doubles who would go around to parties for him, so it seemed as though at a certain point Andy Warhol was just everywhere. You just couldn't get it. I mean, and I think also that was part of the thing. As part of the reason so many people resisted him in the art world and elsewhere was because an artist was supposed to be, you're supposed to be this austere, withdrawn figure and let other people come to you. And Andy was really, you know, quite willing to go to, you know, he said once, I'll go to the opening of anything, even a toilet seat. So, you know, to conclude, I think that Andy, in so many ways, you know, was a kind of, you know, a liberated conformist, in the words of Donald Cuspid. He was someone who, you know, wanted desperately to conform to the American dream. He really wanted to believe that he could have this life for himself. And yet at the same time, as Tom said at the outset, he never lost his awareness. I think it's, you know, a very tragic and kind of you know, almost a pitiful awareness that he was never going to be anything other than an outsider in this society. So with Warhol, you have someone who, in his life and his work, really embodied a lot of the, you know, internal contradictions of the American project, and that's why I put together this concept for the show. So I think maybe it would be interesting to open this up for some questions now, unless.